Welcome to a new video on the Photography Minimalist. In this video I'm going to be using my Minolta X-700 with its 50mm Rocore MC-PG 1.4 standard lens. And this is interesting because I'm only going to be using it at its widest aperture, or at its fastest aperture, of 1.4. And I'm outside at the moment, and the weather conditions are a little brighter than when I started this morning. And I'm using a relatively slow film, the Agfa APX 100, black and white. And the fastest shutter speed I have on the Minolta is 1/1000 of a second, which is not really fast. So it's a challenge to see if I can make all the photos on this APX 100 at the 1.4 aperture. Now you're probably asking yourself, why would I shoot all the photos at 1.4? Well, that brings me back to two questions. First of all, why would you choose a fast lens in the first place? And second of all, why and when would you shoot at the widest aperture, or the fastest aperture, of 1.4? So before I get started making the photos, let's answer those two questions first. Well, without going into too much detail, let me try to give you the answers to these two questions. The first question being, why should you buy fast aperture lenses? Well, that's easy. Fast aperture lenses have better glass. Better glass is going to give you better image quality, specifically regarding edge-to-edge sharpness, color rendition, contrast and clarity, and less chromatic aberration. The second part of the answer would be fast aperture lenses have a better build quality. They are mostly made of metal and glass instead of plastic and glass, and sometimes even plastic and plastic. There are, however, two drawbacks with regards to buying fast aperture lenses. The first one being, of course, the much higher price point. You are going to pay more money for fast aperture lenses. And the second drawback is these lenses mostly, with the emphasis on mostly, have a larger size and a heavier weight. And if you do a lot of traveling with your camera gear, this is an important issue to take into account. Let's look at question number 2. When and why would you use the fastest aperture available on your lens? This is going to be a two-part answer. It has a technical answer and a creative answer. From a technical point of view, you would mostly be using a faster aperture in low light situations, whereby you want to keep your ISO down and maintain your shutter speeds, for example, for handheld shooting. Now this is less relevant when you're using a digital camera, for example a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, than it would be when you're using a film camera. Something to explain. When you're using a film camera, you immediately notice the difference in results when you use a 100 or a 400 ISO film with regards to sharpness and grain, for example. And when you have the most modern digital DSLR or a mirrorless camera, they have very excellent high ISO capabilities. That means it is less relevant to use a fast aperture when you have a digital camera in low light conditions. All that being said, it still makes sense to invest in fast aperture glass because you're overall getting better image quality. Let's look at the creative aspect of fast aperture lenses, because using a very fast aperture creates a very shallow depth of field. And for some other photographers, they might be very interested in a lens-specific bokeh, which is very visible when using a very fast aperture. So let's look at the depth of field. This is something that I worked a lot with during my portrait photography and also my glamour photography that I've been doing for many years. when you want to achieve a very shallow depth of field. Why would you want to achieve this? Well, first of all, to pinpoint focus on the eyes, put all the attention in the photo on the eyes of your portrait. And then the shallow depth of field renders the skin beautifully, slightly out of focus. That's why I used this creative technique in my portrait photography. It's something totally different when I'm using, in this video specifically, a very fast aperture outside in the nature environment. Something you would normally not do. And I've been using 1.4 for the whole film outside. But that brings you in a very challenging position with regards to composition, because you need to know beforehand which element in your composition do you want to pinpoint focus on. Because every other element outside of this very shallow depth of field is going to be out of focus. That means that that specific element within your composition that is spot on focus is going to get all the attention. It's going to be isolated within the composition. So it's much more difficult to get a good composition with a very fast aperture. This was an interesting first composition, focusing on the standing tree trunk, and I have some foreground interest and background interest with 1.4 that I want to throw out of focus. What a beautiful sight. This pine tree broke, fell over, as you can see. And the only thing that's standing, that's remaining, is a very thin piece of tree bark, as you can see. Never seen this before. It's very thin. It's only the tree bark that's left. See if I can make an interesting photo of this. And when the light's gone again, the whole atmosphere changes. We're losing the true depth in the image. So I was just in time. You know, we often talk about morning light and late afternoon or evening light, but what we sometimes forget is the fact that at this time of the year the sun is very low, and even at the time of day, at the moment it's about 12:30, you can really find some very interesting light to photograph. The only thing is, it continuously changes, so you have to have your camera ready to take the photo. But even so, at 1.4, I'm still able to take some very interesting images. again, the light changes drastically. And this is a very interesting composition, even though the light has changed. The only issue I have now is not working with 1.4, but only having my 50mm to work with. I wish I would have had my 28mm. So at least I'm going to take a photo now with my Fuji X10. Well, if you've been watching my videos, then you know that I've been in this location before. And I was in the area, so I thought I'd stop by again for a specific reason. Because I recently watched a documentary and they told about the fact that Hannie Schaft, who was a very famous resistance fighter in the Netherlands during the Second World War, this year was executed here in the dunes exactly 75 years ago. And this year she would have turned 100 years old. So I thought I'd just go by, and if I've seen it correctly, there should be some flowers lying on her grave. They had a recent remembrance of her death. And it was also interesting to know that she was one of 422 bodies that were found here in the dunes that were executed by the Germans in the Second World War, and she was the only woman out of 422 people that received a proper burial here. And what was also interesting to know is that they recently received a photo album of baby and youth photos of Hannie Schaft, something that they did not know existed. So that was also interesting to find out. So let me now make a quick stop at her grave, take a photo at 1.4 and continue on again. This place will always amaze me. Every time I'm here, I turn quiet. I mean, just imagine, this woman, when she was executed in the dunes, was only 25 years old. And the documentary was very informative. I learned a lot about her life, and especially the period of the Second World War, and why she decided to take this action as a resistance fighter. It makes you proud of her. Well, I hope you liked the video and that it was informative. It turned out to be a little bit longer than I expected. In the beginning, when I was making the explanation why and when to use a fast aperture, I mentioned when I was going out into the nature environment that normally you would not use a fast aperture. But that, of course, is incorrect. It's all about the end result you're trying to achieve. Sometimes you want a shallow depth of field, sometimes you want more depth of field. And in this instance, with this film and this lens, I only went for a shallow depth of field. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, greatly appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, you're more than welcome to do so. If you want to leave any comments or suggestions, please feel free to do so. Thanks again, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.